Hello, my name is Afshin Marashi, and I'm the Farzaneh Family Professor of Iranian Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of everyone at the Farzaneh Center and at the University of Oklahoma, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the OU Iranian Studies podcast. This is another in our ongoing series of podcast interviews with visiting speakers at the OU Farzaneh Center and other scholars in the field of Iranian history, culture, politics, and society. We try to keep these interviews informal and friendly, maybe have some fun, and try to spotlight new research in the field and try to get to know some of the people that we're interviewing. Today, we are honored to have with us Aria Fani, Associate Professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of Washington, and the Director of the Persian and Iranian Studies Program at UW in Seattle. Aria, welcome to the OU Iranian Studies Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be in
Good,
conversation. The
good.
honor's all mine.
Thank you. How's your summer?
I just finished teaching, and so my summer officially has begun.
Okay, summer is nice in Seattle, so good, good. I
It
guess
is.
it's
It
August.
is.
We're recording this in August of 2025, so it's also back to school season for me at least. I don't know about you, but we're getting ready
Not
for
anytime soon.
it. Okay, good. Well, Arya has just published his first monograph titled Reading Across Borders, Afghans, Iranians, and Literary Nationalism, published by the University of Texas Press. And I'm really eager to chat with you about the book, Arya. And I'm actually happy to announce that the book has recently been awarded the Rene Wellek Prize by the American Comparative Literature Association. And this is a really big deal. Congratulations, Arya.
Thank you. It was as unexpected as it was fulfilling and delightful.
Well, I'm not surprised because it's just such a great read and really a great work. And you've obviously poured a lot of time and effort and thought into it. And you've really produced something that I think will be read and referred to and people will benefit from for a long time to come. Uh, I should add that the book was actually part of a book series that I co-edited at the University of Texas Press, titled Connected Histories of the Middle East and the Global South. And we're always looking for new manuscripts for the series. So anyone out there listening, please be in touch if you have something that might fit. And as I remember, Aria, your manuscript was one of the very first books or the manuscripts that we recruited for the series.
That's correct. And I was sharing with a colleague that it was between University of Texas Press and another
Hmm.
perhaps more prestigious in name publisher. And when I was speaking with my mentor, Kevin Schwartz,
Oh, good.
he said, go with Texas because that involves developing your relationship with Afshin.
Oh, I
And
see.
I look at it as the best academic decision I've made in the past
That's
6 years.
that that
And
that.
also Texas, in addition to your support from start to finish. I mean, the University of Texas Press right now is doing such an incredible job.
I think so. When I came in, when Jim Burr was the acquisitions editor, I got to know him maybe 12 or 13 years ago, and I just had such a good relationship with him. And that's really, working with a series editor, having a personal relationship with a series editor is obviously very important. And I was really glad to be able to work with you and the other people in the series on their manuscripts. But the acquisition editor, the relationship with the acquisition editor is also really important. And Jim Burr and all the people at UT Press have been really, really good working with them, both for me personally and working for the series. And I think this goes back to 2021 is when you finished. Well, I know you were at Berkeley PhD. When did you finish the dissertation?
August of 2019, then
Okay.
moved to Seattle, and I think um, the whole process took about 2.5 years with the University of Texas Press from
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
very beginning submission of two chapters, a proposal to the basically publication of the book. So
Hmm.
very reasonable.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're really glad with the way it turned out. I guess you were a student of Wali Ahmadi.
That's right. That's right.
I don't know if you know this, but he was also my teacher. Did you know this?
No way. At UCLA?
That's right. I was at UCLA from 93 to '03. I finished in '03. And
Wow.
when I was, first, second, third year graduate student, he was, I don't know if he was a TA or an instructor of Persian, but he was one of my instructors of Persian at UCLA during the 90s. He and Latife Haqiqi, the legendary Latife
The
Haqiqi.
legendary, that's right. Wow.
And then so when he went to Berkeley, I remember I was still, I don't think I had finished my exams yet. But anyway, so yeah, so we are both Wali Ahmadi students in that regard.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
Well, there's so much in the book that we can discuss, and obviously we can't touch on everything, but maybe we can just try to focus on a few broad themes. First, I mean, just the general subject matter of the book. I think it broadly looks at the role that literature has played in the nation building projects of both Iran and Afghanistan in the 19th, 20th century. Is that a fair way of describing the subject matter?
100%. I mean, the genre of the book, I see it primarily as conceptual history.
Hmm.
The center of gravity is how this novel concept that everybody agrees comes from Europe, comes from 19th century Europe, literature, um, basically comes to be thinkable, comes to is transformed into this fixture
Hmm.
uh, in Persian literary tradition, and in the course of half a century becomes institutionalized. And so that's one part of the book. And then the second component of the book is that this process was necessarily transregional
Hmm.
and collaborative,
Hmm.
because one could have told the same story by just focusing on Iran or
Hmm.
focusing on Afghanistan alone.
Right.
That would have been much more justified for Iran, a little less
Hmm.
justified,
Hmm.
sorry, much more justified for Afghanistan, a little bit less justified for
Hmm.
Iran, given the amazing work that people like Farzin Vijdani, you
Hmm.
yourself, Alexander Jabbari have done.
Hmm.
But putting the two together meant
Absolutely.
telling an entirely different story,
Yeah.
a really entangled, connected one.
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's such an important central topic. I remember when I was working on my dissertation, and obviously, I kind of felt that, obviously, literature was sort of the elephant in the room, maybe the most important thing. If you want to understand Iranian nationalism, the history of nation building and the nationalization process, literature was so central to that. But, when I was working on that, I realized that I made a conscious decision not to really work on that topic because I knew how difficult it would be. Literature is a vast, complex, difficult topic, especially in Iranian history, Iranian culture. And so, my nationalizing Iran book, there's very little on literature in there. I mean, I have some stuff on Ferdowsi and, the nation's poet kind of stuff. But I kind of set that aside because I thought it would be too difficult for me to take on a project like that. But that makes me want to just suggest that I'm so happy that people like you and Farzine and Alexander and others have kind of taken up this project of looking at literature seriously and critically in the context of Iran's nation building project and national history, and of course the interconnected context of that is sort of central as well. I think that you've made that point very clear. Maybe I can ask you, one point that I think comes up a little bit in your book, and it's always kind of in the background of my thinking, which is, what is our sort of received wisdom about the relationship between language, literature, and Iranian nationalism? If there is a kind of conventional understanding, I kind of think of a figure like E.G. Brown as sort of representing that traditional understanding. I mean, I mean, maybe let me ask you, let me put it this way. What would E.G. Brown think about your book?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a
I mean,
fabulous.
is he the person you're kind of arguing against? Is that a way of thinking about it?
I think he would definitely recognize many parts of the book. the emphasis on an ecosystem,
Hmm.
this context in which certain ideas, certain behaviors, certain forms of comportment, sociability, adab, become normative. I think he would recognize those parts, right? And this is a constellation of individuals, institutions, mediums that basically make this ecosystem possible. As expansive and as consequential as this was, I also don't shy away in my introduction from saying that ultimately this is a very limited angle as well, because literature as a discipline was incredibly hostile to women,
Hmm.
remains to be, and so a deeply patriarchal tradition, and that is also true across the board. You could find Ottoman uh, female scholars in the 1920s and 30s, maybe more so than Iran and Afghanistan, but by and large in India and in Republican Turkey, across the region, the discipline of literature is very male dominated.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and so I think E.G. Brown would see himself rightly as part of this trans-regional, as Farzin would say, Persian Republic of Letters,
Hmm.
or as Alexander would say, part of this ethos of Persianate modernity. But however you emphasize, whatever you emphasize and de-emphasize, this is what we're talking about. Uh,
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think he had that some of that trans-regional element,
very
but
much.
I think he also kind of doesn't he kind of focus on the relationship between Iran and the Persian language? I mean, I
He
don't know.
does. And
I think we think of sort of national literature and the Iranian project. He kind of was part of that in some way.
yeah, and I think this is where I'd like to mention that in many ways, in very crucial ways, we're all indebted to your first book, Nationalizing Iran, because you really show you restore the agency
Mhm.
to intellectuals both in the diaspora and within Iran, writing within, the pages of newspapers like Kaveh,
Mm.
and you're showing how this interplay between the Orientalists and so-called nativist intellectuals is not at all a straightforward one, is not at all one of wholesale borrowing. Um,
Hmm.
Previous studies may have suggested, in particular, Iran as an imagined community. And so once you show the nuances of what Iranians needed, what they drew from Orientalist knowledge and how they transformed it within their own context, I think then paved the way for the rest of us to come and change the angle a little
Hmm.
bit. And this is all this is, just slightly changing the angle
Yeah.
so that we could see these relationships from a different angle, from a different vantage point.
Well, I think, yeah, it's interesting to see E.G. Brown is really kind of enmeshed in all of that as well. He was as much a participant in these networks, these intellectual networks. I think Farzin has really done a good job writing about that as well.
Uh,
But that idea of, I think one of the terms you use is, the intellectual labor
mhm,
of these figures. And there's of course a whole tradition of thinking about, yes, how dominant were these European categories? Is all of this a kind of derivative discourse, as the Parthy Chatterjee kind of argument? And even his take was always much more complicated than that. But in some ways, I think the intellectual labor that you discuss in some of these figures helps to kind of show that. I think at some point you say that you have a whole discussion about adabiyat and the relationship between that and literature. Maybe you can talk about that. I mean, how does adabiyat, which is sort of this pre-modern notion, how does it, or adab, how does it become conflated or designated as literature in the 20th century? This is another thing that I don't know if E.G. Brown is the origin of this
mhm.
or what it is. But that I think is one of the the important things to think about is how we sort of neatly equate concepts from the pre-modern period to European modern concepts, or how they don't quite coordinate or fit together in some ways. You have a really interesting discussion about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since 2016, we've had a number of studies by Michael Allen, Amir Mufti,
Hmm.
uh, and several others before them, Terry Eagleton, Peter Widowson, who had talked about how novel literature as a conceptual category is. But what all these studies have in common is that they all begin in the aftermath of this conceptual realignment. Now we live in a world where literature has a material and conceptual presence. And so let's talk about the implications that it has for the way we read, what we flag as literary, what we exclude from the category of literature, how professionalization and institutionalization take place, right? But what I tried to do in the book was to make a very strong case for attending to the mistranslations, misalignments, ambiguities, the multiple, the multivalent nature of this conceptual realignment from bringing adabiyat as a plural designation for adab-related sciences and
Mm.
sciences in the classical sense of the term as systematized forms of knowledge to this uh, freestanding, um, fully independent, singular concept that stands for a body of writing
Uh,
prized by the nation that is reflective of its timeless
yes.
civilizational achievements and of a unitary people and their character. And so I really go into the weed. And this is
Yeah, you do. It's great.
the recognition of the ACLA award, the René Willek Award, feels particularly satisfying in this area because this is like the model of comparative literary studies that the field has by and large overlooked,
Hmm.
that they don't get into the field, right? It's always been from Spivak and even before the death of the discipline, the dialectic of how much philological specificity should be balanced with, kind of theoretical, broad-minded meditations on literature, it's taxonomies and whatnot. And so for them to uh, recognize a book like this, and I very much see this prize as one for the field that has allowed me to make my arguments with any degree of clarity and incisiveness in people that have been in conversation with me. You, Kevin Schwartz, Mana Kia, Alexander Jabbari, Samuel
Yeah.
Hutchkin, all of whom have produced outstanding works. For a book like this to be even be thought to be viable as an example for a comparative literary studies model. And so that's really the part that brings me a lot of satisfaction. That these weeds they didn't consider it irrelevant or excessive or something that should only interest Persianists.
Hmm.
It matters that Humay's definition of adabiyat slightly differs from Abbas Iqbal Ashtiani or from Bahar or Qari Abdullah's differs from Mahmud Tarzi. These things matter. People always say, "Oh, yeah, it's malleable. It could have taken numerous scenarios," but we have to do the hard intellectual
Exactly.
labor of recovering all of these scenarios that then later on, due to historical events that one can never really positively uh, fully outline,
Yeah.
it is transformed into the type of discourse that we see today.
Well, I mean, it definitely suggests, what we all sort of know or feel that we didn't until more recently sort of read in the literature is that, this really is a living tradition. And it's not a fixed, ossified, singular, unchanging, institution. It was sort of made to sort of appear that way, but beneath the surface, there is a complexity and a living heritage that's still continuing to evolve and being contested and evolved in all sorts of ways. And looking at the Iran-Afghan relationship really helps to, bring to the surface this diversity of Persian literary cultural heritage, adabiyat in the real sense, which, like you say in the book, it challenges the idea of literature. It's not the idea of literature coming in from the outside and redefining what adabiyat is. What you show is that adabiyat is speaking back to the category of literature. And that's still a process that's still kind of going on today. I mean, this is why the book I think is so relevant. I always say, I'm still waiting. I'm probably maybe one of the, I don't know if I should say this, but maybe I'm one of the last advocates for the Latinization of the Persian script. But even, the script itself, there's nothing, it's arbitrary.
100%.
And
100%.
I keep waiting for the first Latinized Persian novel or short story to be written. I don't, maybe we already have that. I don't
I'm
know.
surprised if it hasn't come out yet.
Not that I know of, not that I know of, but maybe it'll happen somewhere on the West Coast, in the diaspora. But that's what I mean. But that would be part of the tradition that you're describing in the book, this ongoing evolution in its very many multiple varied forms of the Persian literary language tradition. It's sort of similar to the concept of Farhang, I think is another
Absolutely.
idea that needs to be kind of looked at a little bit more critically, like you've done with adabiyat or, miras or even tamadun you mentioned. How do these words that have always existed, how do they come to take on the meanings that they have, and how can those meanings kind of still evolve in all sorts of different kinds of ways? You mentioned actually, I think you mentioned Mahmoud Afshar. One of the really interesting parts of the book is your discussion about his travel and his sort of personal connections to the Afghan Literary Society or the Kabul Literary Association, I think it is. How did
Okay.
that come about? Can you say something about that?
You know, maybe this is a point of paradox, which of course the modern nation state is full of such paradoxes. But at the time when they're trying to shore up a territorial understanding of Iran and national affiliation with an entity that is not just racially, religiously, linguistically identified, but also territorially. Um, to do so requires engagement on a multilingual and transregional and transnational level. And what has been acknowledged so far is that European forms of knowledge uh, have played a tremendous role in bringing about different components of modernity, the nation state being one of them. But what hasn't been acknowledged and is poorly understood to this day is how dialogue among people that are inheritors of the Persian literary tradition, from Indians to Pakistanis to Central Asians to Turks, Arabs, what impact that had. And so this is the climate in which Mahmoud Afshar is engaging with his counterparts in Kabul. Um, Iran, Afghanistan always had plenty of literary connections, but as I say in the book, in the 1920s, when Afghanistan gains its independence from imperial powers and opens embassies to intensify diplomatic and cultural connections, one of the outcomes is more travel, more correspondence, and
Mhm.
in fact, it was the Afghan intellectuals in this case that took the initiative of sending Mahmoud Afshar several copies of the journal Kabul. And of course, he starts reading them with great interest, and it's a little bit incensed by how Afghans are.
Hmm.
engaging exactly in the same historiographical practices that Iranians are. You know, that Mahmud of Ghazni, of course, is an Afghan ruler, and he was making inroads into northern India and in the Kingdom of Afghanistan. These anachronistic backshadowing the manufacturing of a lineage, and that conversation is truly the most fascinating part of the book for me.
Mm. And so how long was he there?
He,
Do you
I
know?
believe, traveled for 2 months,
Okay.
and so the correspondence happens before.
Oh yeah.
And what I find actually really interesting, and I wanted to emphasize this because we often think that these bitter disagreements, of course, in our age of social media, which is so easy to tell somebody off that you know,
Of course.
you don't even see face to face, but they have some bitter disagreements, and in spite of that, he goes to Afghanistan and he travels for 2 months and he's shown the country by Sarwar Khan Guya, um, if not Juya, I always mistake the two of them. Um, and this is remarkable because they are committed to finding shared ground.
That's great.
And of course, ultimately, even though they're using common methods, modern methods of inquiry,
Right.
of historiography, they can't really find a shared, they can't arrive at a shared understanding.
It reminds me of the chapter in my Parsi book about
Mhm.
Hurdavud's travel to Bombay, and that's
Yeah.
the kind of personal history and connection, the intellectual exchange. When I was reading that chapter, I said, "Oh, this is another part of that same story of travel and intellectual engagement between people who feel some shared history, and then they have to reconnect and kind of think about
Well,
what they have in common."
would you have wanted to tell that story if in you know in the 10 years you spent researching that book, you realized that Iranians encounter in Parsis exactly what they anticipated, and the Parsis come to Iran, and they find an Iran that exactly matched their imagination,
Yeah.
and then happily ever after.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's what's the complexity is what's always so interesting, and you've done a great job of trying to do that. I mean, exactly right. I mean, with the Parsis and the Iranians, they are ultimately we're talking past each other. I try to kind of give that some idea of that as well, even though they,
Yeah, on a discursive level, it shows you the precarity of any form of totalizing universalism.
yeah.
That literature is, I was practicing several years ago, I was practicing Spanish with my teacher online who's from Uruguay but lives in Liverpool. And I said, when I say literatura, what comes to your mind? And she said,
Mm,
well, when you say Spanish literature, literatura española or castellana,
mm,
what comes to my mind is the nation state of Spain. And I feel like Latin America is excluded from it. And so,
mm.
just in my mind, during that moment, I'm like, oh my God, look at the intelligibility of this concept across the board among a certain class of people, urban,
Yeah,
university educated. And but when you, as you said, when you take the layers off, you peel them off,
right.
all the ideological fault lines, the misalignments are just laid bare for people to see. That
Absolutely.
when you look at Iran and Afghanistan alone, two countries that we, always undermine ourselves by dismissing them as to margins of
You're right.
the world. But look at how they speak back to the
Right.
totalizing impulses of literature as a category.
I mean,
And
this is why
this
Mhm.
is the type of work that, people like Emily Apter and Amr Mufti, like the giants of the field of comp lit, they talk about, but they end up not doing.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
the hard work is done by so many in our field.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I brought up E.G. Brown. I remember many years ago when I was still a grad student, I had a kind of a tense conversation with someone, a specialist of South Asian studies, sort of a senior person. I won't say who it was. But when I mentioned E.G. Brown, this person did not like E.G. Brown because they thought that E.G. Brown didn't give South Asian Persian its sort of central place. It
Rightly
was a
so. He did
kind
not.
of
It's
degenerate.
valid.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like what your teacher in Latin America and Spanish was sort of thinking along the same lines. And that was a very critical moment for me too. It was a long time ago. I was like, oh wow, I have a
Yeah.
kind of Iranian centric understanding of Persian literature and language, and I have to kind of figure out where that comes from, you know.
He's very unapologetically clear about his purview.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know, he's like, yeah, I'm writing the literary history of Persia, which deals with the Persian soul and the
exactly.
Persian mind. These are
Yeah.
all singular, of course, fixtures. And therefore, I'm including Iranians like Ibn Muqaffa or Sibawayh who've written in Arabic, but I'm excluding non-Iranians who've composed in Persian because it's just not reflective of the Iranian soul. And you could read it with intellectual generosity and say, well, there is a body of work in India, especially 50, 60 years after the Mughals have gained enough resources and confidence to like really have their own Indian, Indo-Persian literature, right? That they're
Hmm.
far less reliant on tutors and scholars and poets coming from Central Asia and West Asia, and that the type of work that requires prior knowledge of Sanskritic forms of knowledge, that's the
Yeah,
type of work that is not reflective of an Iranian
that's true.
kind of literary sensibility, right? It would be kind of a problematic thing to say, but there's really truth to it. And so maybe it's a difference in parlance.
Hmm.
Um, but then the premise is often what gets neglected, right? Which is, well, why sit down to write the literary history of a race?
Yeah,
Why
right.
sit down to write the literary history of just one territory?
Exactly.
And so
Yeah.
that's the type of, question that we need to be raising.
And I think what the way you've answered that is part of a larger debate that's going on in our field, which is, sometimes we call it the Persianate history and how the Persianate evolves in various forms in the 19th and 20th century. It seems like we're kind of in a period where there's a lot of creative, productive work that's coming out to kind of think about the early modern and modern period, in the sort of trans-regional Persianate history that has all of the complexities and contradictions that we should sort of think about and not romanticize. But your book, Alexander Jabari's book, Samuel Hodgkin's great book. You mentioned Kevin Schwartz, Mauna Kea, I would say her book is sort of on this topic as well. James Pickett on Central Asia, I
James
think.
Pickett, yeah, yeah, Polymaths of Islam.
So I think, we're kind of living through a very, despite all the problems with the field and with universities, we're actually fortunate to be living through a very creative period in the field of Iranian studies and Persian literary history, just by looking at all of these things that have come out in recent times, recent years. But I'm wondering if you can just say, maybe we can just try to wrap up. I mean, where do you think what are the frontiers there? What are the remaining sort of frontiers that have yet to be explored in the context of Persian literary history and the national history?
That's a fabulous question. I would say two things, perhaps related, but seemingly also independent of one another. One is that we need to carry out more uh, micro, granular
Hmm.
level work.
Hmm.
My colleague Purnima Devan and Heidi Powell's recently published a book about the multilingual literary output of Vali of Deccan. It's a really, really exciting work that deals with Deccani, of
Mm.
Richt, of Persian, smatterings of Arabic. This is the type of work that really needs to be done so that we can once and for all really shatter these grand narratives of Persian having unrivaled primacy in South Asia and in Iran as well, understanding
Of
how
course, yeah,
Armenian, how Azeri Turkish, how George, how all these languages were their social space in the Qajar court and in the Safavid court. And then secondly, you mentioned universities and the unraveling of higher education in this current fascistic moment. And that takes me to my desire to see a lot more work done on contemporary Iran. And that is something that, I need to do a better job of myself. But you have so many millions and millions of dollars poured into such a narrow field of ancient Iranian studies, languages like Middle Persian that have perhaps 200 extant texts.
Hmm.
And you have sometimes the same university has two or three scholars of Zoroastrianism, of Middle Iranian languages. Um, I don't think this type of emphasis is justified. I think it's ideologically driven. I think it's deeply orientalistic and misguided. And I also think that it hurts um, the cause of presenting Iran in all of its complexity and dynamism, right? I mean, there's just so little that is done on contemporary Iran. Uh, we have one of the healthiest, literary productions in the region, in spite of the fact that, we only have what, some 40, 50 million people who speak Persian as a first language. And so I would like to see a lot more emphasis
Hmm.
on contemporary projects
That's great.
in conversation with Turkish and Arabic and Urdu.
Yeah, I mean the Caucasus and the Ottoman zone, I think, is also historically speaking another in contact zone that hasn't really been looked at. But I think you're absolutely right. The modern and contemporary period is underdeveloped um, for maybe reasons that are some of which you mentioned. But I think we can definitely try to build on that. And I think your book is a very good example of the kind of serious, granular, but conceptually very important and sophisticated work that can serve as a model for 19th, 20th, and 21st century cultural studies and history. I think we have a lot more that we could discuss with the book. I encourage everyone to take a look, but we should probably try to end it here. And I'll congratulate you once again, Aria, on the book and for winning the Welleck Prize. And thanks for joining us on the OU Iranian Studies podcast. It's been nice chatting with you. It's always great to see you. I don't see you very often. I don't know if we've seen each other on Zoom probably more than we've met.
That's right. We've crossed paths in conferences, which seems like a bygone era.
Well, hopefully I'll see you at next year's Iranian Studies Conference if
I
you're,
hope so
I
too.
hope so. And thanks for all of our listeners for listening. And we'll try to continue these podcasts and bring more interviews and try to contribute to an ongoing discussion about the field of Iranian studies and Persian literature and cultural history. I will say goodbye. Thank you so much. Until next time.